The moon hung low in the ink-black sky, its pallid glow barely illuminating the desolate stretch of road ahead. Sarah, a young woman with a nervous disposition, gripped the steering wheel tightly as she navigated through the dense forest. She was alone, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to reach out with skeletal branches, as if trying to snatch her from the safety of her car. The radio crackled with static, occasionally punctuated by distorted voices. She tried to turn it off, but it seemed to have a mind of its own, refusing to comply. The unnatural sounds made her skin crawl, and she shivered in response. Something was not right. She had chosen this desolate route to save time on her journey home, but regret gnawed at her. The shadows danced menacingly on the periphery of her vision, and every rustle of leaves sent her heart racing. She knew she was being watched. Miles seemed to blur into one another, the road monotonous and unending. The darkness pressed against the windows, making her feel claustrophobic. She glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. In the dim glow, she saw a figure standing by the side of the road, barely visible in the shadows. Her foot instinctively hit the brakes, and the car screeched to a halt. She turned to look again, but the figure had disappeared. She tried to shake off the unease, blaming it on her tired mind playing tricks. She drove on, but the feeling of being watched persisted. A sudden flash of light blinded her momentarily, and she swerved the car, narrowly avoiding a collision with an oncoming truck. Heart-pounding, she glanced back at the road, but the truck had vanished without a trace. The road seemed to stretch on forever, an endless tunnel of trees and darkness. Sarah felt a knot of dread forming in her stomach. She reached for her phone, intending to call for help, but it slipped from her grasp and clattered onto the floor. As she bent down to pick it up, a phantom chill enveloped the car. The temperature seemed to plummet, and her breath formed frosty clouds in the air. She looked up, and her blood turned to ice. In the distance, she saw a flickering light. It danced like a will-o'-the-wisp, leading her deeper into the forest. Panic set in as she realized she was no longer in control of the car. It moved of its own accord, following the mysterious light. Fear gnawed at her as the trees loomed closer, their twisted branches scratching the sides of the car. The light led her down a narrow, winding path, surrounded by darkness that seemed to consume everything. Suddenly, the car jerked to a stop. The engine sputtered and died. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, drowning out every other sound. She fumbled to restart the engine, but it remained lifeless. The car's interior was suffocating, and she felt an oppressive presence closing in on her. Trembling, she peered outside into the darkness. There, in the shadows, lurked faceless figures, their eyes glowing with an eerie, malevolent light. Her breath hitched, and she realized she was not alone. The figures drew closer, surrounding the car. Their whispers filled the air, a cacophony of incomprehensible voices that sent shivers down her spine. They beckoned to her, their bony fingers tapping on the windows. In a desperate attempt to escape, she forced the car door open and ran into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches reaching out like gnarled hands trying to grab her. She stumbled and fell, her hands scraping against the rough ground. She looked back to see the figures emerging from the darkness, their ghostly forms advancing towards her. She let out a scream, but the forest swallowed her cries. She knew she was trapped, lost in a nightmare from which there was no waking. As the figures closed in, the forest fell silent, engulfing the horror that unfolded within its depths. Sarah's heart pounded like a war drum, her breaths ragged and desperate as she sprinted through the eerie forest. The moonlight played tricks, casting eerie, shifting shadows that danced on the trees, making it impossible to discern reality from her imagination. She tripped over a protruding root, crashing to the ground. Panic surged through her veins as she scrambled back to her feet and continued her frenzied flight. But no matter how fast she ran, the figures seemed to keep pace, their ghostly forms becoming more distinct with every fleeting moment. Soon, she found herself in a clearing, the moonlight breaking through the canopy, revealing an old, dilapidated cabin at its center. Desperation pushed her towards it, hope flickering like a dying ember in her chest. Maybe she could find safety within those decaying walls. She flung open the cabin door and stumbled inside, gasping for breath. The air was damp and stale, a heavy scent of decay hanging in the air. The flickering light of a single, dim bulb revealed a room frozen in time, covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. Sarah's eyes darted around the room, searching for a way to defend herself or escape. As her eyes settled on the boarded-up windows, she knew her options were dwindling. She could hear the figures outside, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. She hurriedly began removing the boards, desperation lending her strength. But as she worked, she noticed something unsettling. The figures were no longer outside. They stood in the room with her, their twisted forms contorting and shifting in the dim light. Terror gripped her heart as she realized she was trapped. There was no escape. The figures closed in, their ghostly breath chilling the air around her. Their fingers brushed against her skin, ice-cold and insubstantial, sending shivers down her spine. In a last, desperate attempt to survive, she turned and fled deeper into the cabin. Every step felt like wading through molasses, the air growing thicker with malevolence. The walls seemed to close in on her, the very structure of the cabin transforming into a grotesque, living entity. She burst into a room, a bedroom, its floor covered in rotting wood and fallen debris. The figures continued to follow, their spectral presence suffocating her. There was no escape, she was trapped in a waking nightmare. With a sinking feeling of dread, she realized the figures were her own reflection, distorted and twisted by the decaying mirrors that adorned the walls. The truth was too horrifying to comprehend. The cabin was a cruel trap, a malevolent entity preying on her fears and insecurities. A deafening cacophony of whispers filled the air, drowning out her own terrified sobs. The mirrors shattered, each shard reflecting a different facet of her fear. She screamed, her voice lost in the pandemonium. And then, everything fell silent. Sarah found herself back in her car, parked on the side of the road. The forest was still, the moonlight serene and gentle. Trembling, she realized it had all been a nightmare, a vivid, mind-bending dream.